I mentioned a little earlier 3 responsibilities that this work demands: skill, courage, and compassion. The first one seems obvious, and those of you who have studied journalism and who still practice journalism realize your skills grow every day if you keep at it. Those of you in the room who are students, you just need to keep working at those skills. I'll say one thing about the development of the skills of journalism. It doesn't happen overnight. I can't tell you how many students have come to me or young journalists and said, hey, how do you win a Pulitzer? And I say, hey, one story at a time. They don't like the answer. And then I tell them, they say, well, I'm frustrated, I don't think I'm going anywhere. And I said, okay, if you're not cut out to be a journalist, you can figure that out, but do me a favor, don't quit until you get good. And you probably won't get good until you're in your late 20s or early 30s. It takes a long time to practice. Journalism, like me, journalism in my mind is like music or sports. It's another language, and if you don't practice it every day, you never get skilled. I think because we grow up writing, there's this assumption that we know how to write, when the truth is this is a different kind of writing, and every day you have to practice it. But what are the other 2? Skill, courage, and compassion. There's a lot of talk about courage in journalism. Some of it requires the raw physical kind of courage, being in war zones, covering street riots, going to places like Haiti after the earthquake, the Far East after the typhoon, where journalists are literally living in harm's way. Journalists used to be sort of protected. They had this bubble of protection around them, but in the Middle East now, journalists have become targets. I can't tell you the admiration and respect and gratitude I have for the journalists who are willing to do that work. I was never in a direct war zone. I was in Iraq right after the first Persian Gulf War with the refugees as Saddam was pushing them over the mountains. We got into Iraq, we hitchhiked into Iraq about the same time that the military came in to establish a safe no-fly zone. So we weren't in direct war conflict, but there were snipers all over. Mostly in my work, I've been exposed to diseases I don't even care to think about. The more usual but equally necessary courage requires that we as journalists understand and honor our role in society, a role that is sometimes lonely, often uncomfortable, and increasingly unpopular, and that's the courage to speak truth to power. We must ask the hard questions those in authority don't want to answer. We must sit through long government meetings and power through tedious documents to track the truth behind the spending and serving or failing to serve the public. I don't know if coming from the Watergate generation made it easier for my colleagues, my contemporaries, to challenge authority. I don't know if it was easier for me at the time or if I just remember it that way. I know it was the expectation, and I know it wasn't very popular. It took 20 years for my parents to accept what I did for a living, and I still think they were just being polite. We are attacked more today than we were when I was first out of school, by people who would silence us, by people who want to blame the media for spin, for bias. But as civil discourse becomes less and less civil, and as agenda drives politics, takes over the internet and airwaves with spin and vitriol and lies, journalists have to find a way to not only stand in for a confused and frightened and often misled public, to correct the record, but to reach out to the public and let them know we are there for them and that we do our job for them. I think it's one of the mistakes we've made, is to assume that people knew that and knew why we did that. What we do, if we do it with skill and courage and compassion, is done for the purpose of service. I literally think of journalism as service, not in an arrogant way, but in a very selfish way, because by serving, I'm living out my values. That brings me to the last and perhaps most puzzling of my triad of journalistic responsibilities, which is compassion. I had a student at Marquette recently come to me and say, have one of those tearful conversations. I've learned as a teacher that one of the most important things I can do is have a lot of Kleenex in my office. And if I haven't had at least 6 people bursting into tears in the first 2 weeks of the semester, I'm convinced I'm doing something wrong. So this student was all upset. Her parents had paid for this education. Missouri's got this big, lofty reputation. And I kept saying, well, what's wrong? She's like, I can't be a journalist. I just can't do this. And I said, well, why? You're doing very, very well. She had all the skills she needed. And she said, I just don't think I can do this because I care too much. I care too much. And I said, well, what are you talking about? And she said, well, we're told that we have to be objective. We're told we can't care. We're told we can't have any opinion. We're told we can't get involved. I don't think I can do journalism. I've heard that way, way, way too often from young journalists who have the myth of objectivity shoved on them and misinterpreted. Now, part of her caring too much is indeed a concern about how to negotiate these tricky shoals of bias and opinion. That's a legitimate thing that journalists have to struggle with and figure out. But much of it really does seem exacerbated by the misuse and misinterpretation of the ubiquitous and troubling word objectivity. I was interviewed this morning on Wisconsin Public Radio, and I'm terrified that they're going to edit it down to a little bite where I said, I tell my students if there's one word I'd like to eradicate from their vocabulary, it's objectivity. Now, if that's all that's ever said and my dean hears it, I'm going to be having a little chat next week and be very, very thankful for tenure. The deal is we have used objectivity and has used it as shorthand for the wrong things. And as opposed to understanding what it really is, we've let it become this shield and this kind of comfortable bubble, and we've turned it into something it was never intended to be. I hope every student here at some point reads Kovach and Rosenstiel's book, The Elements of News, where they explain what objectivity really is, which is a method of reporting. In the same way that objectivity in science is a method of discovery, objectivity in journalism is a method of reporting. It means being able to prove and have others replicate and prove your facts. It means transparency. It means being able to vet things with multiple sets of eyes. It does not mean turning off your humanity. We have a job that is, I believe, public service. We chase our own kinds of fires. We put out those fires, and on our best days, we bring hope to those we serve. We are, or should be, above all, reliable. We should show up. But I don't think that's enough. I don't think we should do our jobs from the safe and false distance of objectivity. I think we need to understand what objectivity really is. I think we need to get out there in the bloody and scared and cold scrum of life. We need to be where our neighbors are when they need us the most. We need to be present, and we need to pay attention. So what does that mean for the journalist, to be present? Mostly it means doing our job, the jobs the public still needs us to do despite the internet. It means doing those jobs, however, with a greater sense of purpose. If you don't believe that journalism is a fundamental component of a livable society, then why should anyone else? If you don't believe or aren't curious about the world you wade into each day, why would your readers be curious about it? If you don't care about the stories you tell and the difference you make by telling them, how can they make a difference? More practically, being present means two things: showing up, which is the first rule of a worthwhile life, and paying attention once you get there. Show up at the school board meeting and pay attention to the people at the head of the table and to those in the audience and to those who can't afford to go to the meeting. Show up at the Planning Commission meeting and pay attention to the forces of power that shape decisions. Show up at your source's office and ask the questions the public needs answers to. Show up when a tragedy visits your community and pay attention to both the systems and the emotions. Report the infrastructure of your world and the infrastructure of your world's heart. Show up for the stories you are most reluctant to do, most bored by, most fearful of. And then pay attention with so much energy that you can't help but find your way to a story that matters.